Hey, Judgers. Hope you're doing well. Hope you have enough energy to take this course onto the finish line. We're getting nearer to the end. Two more basic reading units. Also, this week marks the end of the Yi book. So, if you can power through the last chapter in Yi, you've accomplished a great deal. And I hope you found that to be a rewarding experience. This week we have the story of Micah, and not Micah the prophet, but a different Micah. And I'll bet that this is a story, if you grew up in the church, that you never ran across this in Sunday school. It's a very different sort of story, it's a bizarre story, and people really have not known exactly what to do with this. So, in some sense, it seems to be very separated, I guess, from the rest of the book of Judges because, first of all, there's no judging going on at all. Yahweh is remarkably absent from most of the passage, not completely, but mostly absent. And it just seems to be a general deterioration in the state of worship and the state of law abidingness of the Israelites. So a lot of people have said, well, this was just tacked on to the book of Judges and it doesn't really fit here, but where else are you going to put it in the Bible? So it ended up here. Personally, I think it fits the book of Judges well because it shows, again, this is my opinion, that trajectory of the breakdown of the tribal system. So you don't have to buy my argument, but I think it works perfectly and it leads up to the travesty that's coming at the end of Judges. So, one thing we see here in this situation is that this system of localized worship, which ultimately will be transformed, if you will, through various means into centralized worship at Jerusalem, which works to an extent and doesn't work to an extent. But that this system of decentralized worship is subject to great abuse. And there's no regulation as to what's going on. And when we get to First Samuel, we see that the situation in Shiloh is maybe not quite as bad, but it's still, I think, in the view of the writer, still very bad. So, in some sense, perhaps this is making an argument for having centralized worship in Jerusalem. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the course video for this week and the idea of rhetorical criticism and sort of what is the text arguing for, which to my mind is not always clear, but there are some things we can pull out of there. Also in this text, for those of you who had questions about the ephod, this shirt or apron like thing that popped up in the story of Gideon, it comes back. So, and it comes back in a really intense way. And I think this is a good time to sort of maybe try to tackle that and understand more deeply why the ephod may have been a snare for Gideon. So what is this ephod? It starts off as a prescribed priestly garment. So it's a special garment made for the priests. It's made out of linen. And again, it's some kind of shirt or apron-like thing. And it's just a mark of priestliness, I guess. It's a mark of the priestly office. Now, over time, at least when we look at various other instances where the ephod pops up, it seems to have evolved into something more than what it started off being. And it seems to signify that the wearer is receiving some sort of direct communication from Yahweh. And probably in the Deuteronomistic history, the two times it's most prominent are number one in the story of Samuel. So I don't know if you remember this story, but Samuel is a little kid and he actually receives a word of prophecy at the shrine at Shiloh It's not a good message, but he is like a little kid prophet. And probably one of the cutest stories in the Bible, every year his mom comes up to Shiloh and makes him a new ephod. And so she kind of lets him grow into his role as a prophet. So it's somewhere it's marking also the sign of prophecy, or the sign of being a prophet. Also, David has one for some reason, and he seems to want to wear it or use it. It's not exactly clear what it is that they do with this thing, but when I imagine it, I imagine that they put it on, and then then they understand that while they have this on, that Yahweh is supposed to speak to them in a more direct way. So when David wants to know Yahweh's will, sometimes he will say, "Get the ephod," and he'll use it or put it on or whatever it is that they do with it, and then he will get a word from Yahweh. Sure enough. Now, what David does makes us, or at least it makes me, a little bit uncomfortable because his practices seem kind of dangerously close to magic, or that this shirt has some sort of special power, like a crystal ball or something like that. And I think in the same vein, Micah sets one up probably to develop some sort of fortune telling business. And something like, if you've heard of the Oracle at Delphi, if you want to get an answer to life's problems, you don't put it in a discussion board of the internet. You don't, this is old and dated, but you don't write a letter to Ann Landers. You go to the Oracle at Delphi and you get an answer to your question. So maybe this is something about what Micah is doing with this thing, that you come to his shrine, you look at his fancy idol that's made out of silver, you're supposed to be impressed by that, and then he maybe tells you your future and you pay him money to do this. Now, in David's case, since we were talking about Disney stories, I think that was last week in the Samson story. There's an old movie by Disney by the name of Dumbo. And Dumbo's this sort of clumsy little elephant with big ears. And like many Disney stories, he's rejected and alienated. But eventually he realizes that he is able to fly. Now, Dumbo thinks that he is able to fly because of this sort of magic feather that he's found. And so he lends all of his power, the source of his power, to the feather. And in fact, it has nothing to do with the feather at all. It's all about his ears. And as I recall, it's been a long time since I've seen this movie. He loses the feather and he panics because it's like he's lost his power. But the power actually has been there all along. He's just misattributed it to the feather. And sometimes I think of the ephod in the same way, that when David uses this ephod, when he puts it on and he gets a message from Yahweh, um, did he really need to do that? Or is this just something he has tended, some sort of ritual that he has tended to associate with getting a message from Yahweh? And even if David thinks that this is the way to get a message, I'm not sure that Yahweh thinks that way. Sometimes I think God goes a long way just to sort of humor us in our kind of quirky nonsensicalness. So I don't know, you can do with that what you will. But I think, getting back to our story of Micah, I think it's just striking once again how absent Yahweh is from this story. And the few times that Yahweh is even mentioned, so there's no direct action of Yahweh, at least that I can recall, but Yahweh is mentioned a couple times, and one of the times is when the mother recovers her silver from her son who's stolen it from her. I would guess this is probably her dowry, um, that she consecrates the silver to Yahweh, and then she proceeds to make an idol. And certainly this is not lawful at all. And I think it goes to show how ignorant the mother is about any kind of law. And we talked way early on in the course that the Deuteronomist is really interested in the passing on of and teaching the law from generation to generation to generation. And I think the mother comes across quite ignorant of what it is that she's even doing, except that she realizes that this is going to be a way to invest her savings and make a profit. Of course, it doesn't turn out for either of them. Getting back to Gideon, and thinking of the possibilities of the ephod being perhaps a money-making proposition, we think of Gideon and we're told that he has 70 sons, or actually 71 sons. And I don't know about you, but I'm guessing that this took a fair number of wives to produce 70 sons. And this is quite a household, and probably required quite a bit of land. And I think it's a fair assumption that Gideon was, or eventually became, a very wealthy man. So did the ephod that Gideon have somehow contribute to his wealth? Did people bring offerings to his shrine? And this was sort of a source of problems for Gideon. So now that I read this story, we've read stories together quite a bit in this course. So now that I read the story of Micah together with Gideon, and I think about them together, I wonder if maybe that was part of the problem in the Gideon story, even though, of course, that is not explicit in the Gideon story at all. But one does have to wonder about this. So you can give that some thought. You certainly don't have to agree to me. It's not something that's explicit in the text at all. But it's weird that we have two stories about an ephod in a relatively short book. So it must be something. So this week, I would like for you to think about some questions once again, and I'm going to give you a variety of questions. You can pick from one or several of these, or at this point in the course, if you want to write on something else, I would be perfectly fine with that too. But just to get you thinking, here's my first question. Given all of the problems that are inherent in money and religion kind of working together, why is this story not more well known? And I would say before I started teaching Judges, I had never read this story before. And if I had skimmed over it and really didn't look at it more closely. But over the years, as I've looked at the story again and again, it's so clear how money corrupts religion, or how these two things, can be like fire and gasoline in some sense. So why don't we hear the story more often? What do you ultimately think of Micah's fate? Is it expected? Did he deserve a greater punishment, or was his fate? I'll let you read the story yourself, so I won't spoil the ending here. But is his fate kind of what you would expect, or do you think it's that justice has been served here in some way? So that's one topic you can write on about, or something about that. The second one, I'm going to ask you whether you think the story fits in the book of Judges, or if you think it seems more like an epilogue or an appendix or kind of an afterthought, sort of a part of the collection that doesn't belong very neatly with the whole. So is it just an epilogue, or is it some random stories that got stuck on the back that we have to work through? So you can think about that. And then finally, what is the reason that you think the text attributes to the tribal system breaking down? So as I mentioned before, and we'll talk about in the course video, that arguably the tribal system is just a disaster by the end of the book of Judges. So, according to the text, why does the tribal system break down? Or you can speculate, why do you think the tribal system is breaking down? And because it's kind of the divinely ordained form of government, if you will, for the Israelites, or the form of running society, I guess. So what happened? Why did this not work? And if you're thinking about the law, I wonder if maybe, remember we have this commandment in Deuteronomy to teach the law at every possible opportunity. And I'm wondering if maybe teaching the law requires some sort of institution. How is that carried on from generation to generation? Now we have social institutions, the church, seminaries, universities, that pass on this knowledge from generation to generation. So there's a structure for doing that. But the Bible doesn't seem to have that structure. It relies heavily on families. And I just wonder, if that is sufficient. And it seems like in this case, at least, it wasn't sufficient. So those are just some questions, food for thought. If you want to write about that, great. If you want to write about something else, that's perfectly fine. Anyway, again, hang in there. We're coming up to the end, so keep on moving. Don't lose enthusiasm now, and we'll see you a little bit later. Hope things are going well. Talk to you soon. Bye.